Hello and welcome back to another episode of World Traveler Commentary. Now, I've recently moved. I'm now in Indonesia, so it's taken a little while to get back on my feet and get ready to perform more of these. You'll have to accept the sound of thunder in the background. Sometimes rains here in the evening. So I wanted to do a discussion of social philosophies in the West, because I think especially people throw terms like Nazism and fascism and socialism around and often don't really understand what they mean. We've already talked quite a bit about liberalism, so I'm not going to cover that one. So I actually thought I'd start with the sort of the least radical reaction to liberalism that we saw in the early 20th century, and that's fascism. You see several major reactions to liberalism occur in the 19th and 20th centuries. Of these, fascism is the one that gets brought up in political arguments all the time. But oftentimes I think people don't really understand where the movement came from, what its basic philosophy was, and things like that. And I'm not going to really cover Nazism in this series, because Nazism, as far as I've been able to find, I haven't been able to find a lot of actual social philosophy thought behind it. It looks to me more like a fascist-inspired sort of popular revolt rather than a distinct set of ideas. But fascism itself arose with a distinct set of ideas, and understanding those ideas is really key to kind of understanding American politics today, where it goes wrong, as well as politics in some other countries, which I'm not going to name. So the fundamental problem is that liberalism doesn't deliver what it promises to for most people. Promises freedom, prosperity, and so forth, and for the vast majority of people, you end up with wage slavery, basically, or an ability to, work for destitution wages. You're separated from everybody. You're separated from family support. And consequently, this atomization and level of vulnerability that people face is quite a significant problem. Oh, cool. We're hearing car alarms from the thunder. That's nice. Anyway, so the basic issue is in Italy, between the wars, you start seeing really dedicated fascist movement intellectually as well as socially. And this comes out of a mixture of right-wing and left-wing groups. It's sort of one of the very interesting things that I think Marx's historical dialectic concept kind of gets right, is that very oftentimes you see new movements coming up out of sort of dialogues of differences in the paradoxes within a society. And so here you have certain left-wing groups, you have certain right-wing groups, they get together, and the basic philosophy that results. Oh, we're getting really near. This will be fun. Anyway, the basic philosophy that results starts off with certain things which are completely true, but then copies some of the same mistakes as liberalism and ends up with something that looks like, in some ways, like a grotesque caricature of liberalism in some ways, but has a number of other problems on its own. And I would contend this is because what fascism did not do is sort of reopen the question of the Hobbesian state. So, as I've covered in the liberal series, which you're welcome to look at, Hobbes arose as a major thinker with the idea of sort of the state, which is there to protect people from bad things, using the manifesting the will of the people, which is personified in that of an absolute ruler, typically an absolute monarch. As I say, the United States is an extremely Hobbesian state. And the presidency is almost a perfect implementation of a Hobbesian absolute monarch. So this is where a lot of things go wrong. So fascism starts off with the observation that this atomization that liberalism provides is harmful, right? And therefore, the issue that fascism tries to solve is the fact that liberalism alienates us from one another, separates us from the sort of support, and consequently the metaphor that becomes the defining image of fascism is that of the Roman Fascia, which is sometimes called a mace. It is a symbol. It was a symbol of authority, and basically it was a bunch of small rods, small sticks, bound together typically around an axe. You'll see these, for example, in the seal of the United States or on some United States money and things like that. It's not a controversial symbol looking back at Rome, and of course they would do the Roman salute, which of course the Nazis have copied. People now think of it as a Nazi salute, but it was like the Nazis copied it from the fascists. The fascists copied it from the Romans. Just to say that again, because under the Nazis copied it from the fascists copied the salute from the Romans. So to start off with this idea, then the fascia becomes the symbol, and the symbol becomes sort of the main marketing material, which is like the sticks in a fascia, we are individually weak, but we are stronger together. Okay. Now that's obviously true, and it's true. It addresses a major weakness of liberalism. The problem, though, is that fascism then assumes that you have a unitary society, a totalitarian, all-encompassing society, which is then going to be controlled, regulated, and steered by a unitary state. Okay, now society is totalitarian and all-encompassing. Everything we do has a social context, and that part is true. But it is not unitary, right? Everything, the Aristotelian view is that we start with small units and larger units build up around it. The Hobbesian view is that everything starts at the top in sort of this unitary structure, and this is where the problem is. When I come back and I contrast fascism with social democracy in another episode, I think like the major thing that differentiates social democracy in Europe from fascism has been the emphasis on localism in social democracy. In other words, the recognition that society isn't unitary, and the need for local variation to take into account different community needs from one place to another. But fascism can't allow for that because the idea is the society is unitary. Now, once we get to this point, one of the things that always happens when I have this conversation with Americans is, Americans use fascism as a cue for anything I don't like, right? And once you start going back to the sort of 1930s Italian sources, people start backing off because the United States, both parties are very, 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 very close to what the Italian fascists were all about. Now people say, but what about the extreme xenophobia? Yeah, well, you see that in both parties today. One party is a little more vocal about it, and the other party is a little more inclined to act on it, but you see extreme xenophobia across both parties in the US today. And so, I've had people tell me, well, that's not what fascism means today, but we can't talk about these things unless we can go back to the origins. So, one of the key points here is that once you believe in a unitary society, xenophobia necessarily follows, okay? And once you believe in a unitary state, social implementation of xenophobia necessarily follows. This is because different communities have different rules, and if the state has to be unitary, it has to pick winners and losers. If there are countries that have been going through 8 years of civil war, out of the question of, who is the winner and who is the loser, specifically out of this issue of Unitarians. Unitarian state, Unitarian society. The idea, again, you see from the Democrats in the US, that we have to convert ideologically the entire country to our ideas, rather than creating a framework where people can work through their differences, find common cause, and work for the betterment of their communities. I'm going to say the same thing about the Republicans. The Republicans aren't really that different from the Democrats in this regard. So, if I were to look around and see a country which is an implementation of fascism in, the world today, the first example I would look at would be the United States. And that's not a very popular thing to say, but I think, if you're looking at historical strands of history, it's very, very, very hard to argue with that. The second thing is, people try to define fascism as a total union of government and business, sort of a government-industrial complex. This again follows from this concept of a unitary society, which encompasses everything from the family, the corporations, everything else. Not a unitary, a totalitarian society. And in fact, you see this complete union of business and government and social democracies also. It's not something that's particular to fascism. But what makes fascism unique in this regard is the centralized control in the hands of the centralized state. While in social democracies it tends to be local institutions or local governments having strong ties to local businesses and things like that. I don't think I would call the Bank of North Dakota, which invests in North Dakota startups, to be that kind of union of business and central government. It's much more along the lines of the social democracy movement in that case. In fact, one of the great ironies is that you see more social democracy in the US and rural communities than you do in big cities. Which is probably why Republicans talk nice to rural people but never give rural people power. What does this mean then, looking forward? So the Marxist historians tend to look at fascism as an economic and political system which comes out of the failures of capitalism. This is, like much Marxist history, quite accurate and yet incomplete. It's not merely the failure of capitalism, it's the failure of liberalism. as a political ideology. And it is, that leads to fascism. And it's not merely a class expression of that. Instead, it's a philosophical unwillingness to confront some of the areas in which liberalism was, I think, we can show objectively well. So, if we want to come up with a better society going forward, one has to push back harder on, I think, the Hobbesian view of the state. And also check ourselves quite a lot when we think that society should mean that we're all the same and we all agree on those things, because societies don't work that way, right? We're all going to have disagreements, and we should have disagreements. We should have different interests, and we should be able to come together and work, find out where our interests are in common and work together on those pieces. So that's what I have on this point. I think next time I'll come back and I'll talk about social democracy, which I think is a close cousin of fascism, but it's something that actually does away with the major problems there. And another time I'll come back and I'll talk about Christian democracy. Thank you very much. Have a great day. See you later.